My name is Rachel Monroe, and I am 32 years old. For most of my life, Thanksgiving meant sitting at the edge of a table that never quite had room for me. That November in Chicago, I told myself it would be different. I told myself I was done swallowing things. But where my father stood up with his glass raised and looked right past me like I was part of the furniture, something that had been holding itself together inside me for years finally gave way. I stood up. The room went quiet, and within the hour, everything my brother had built his perfect life on began to crack. What would you have done, sitting where I was sitting? Stay with me. Because this story does not end the way anyone at that table expected. Let me take you back to where it started. Chicago in late November has a particular kind of cold, the kind that gets under your coat before you even reach the front door. My parents' house in Oak Park smelled the way it always did that time of year. Roasted turkey, cinnamon from the candles my mother lined along the windowsills, the faint trace of my father's aftershave mixing with everything else. The dining room table had been extended with the leaf insert, covered in a pressed ivory cloth, the good china my mother only brought out twice a year. I had driven 2 hours in traffic to be there. I had told myself this year would be fine. I was seated at the far end, near the doorway to the kitchen, where the draft came in every time someone went to refill a dish. My brother's wife sat next to him at the center of the table, their 2 kids flanking them like a portrait. My brother, I'll call him by what he's always been to this family, the golden one, the one who could do no wrong, had his arm draped over the back of her chair, relaxed in the way that people are relaxed when they know a room belongs to them. I had brought a salad and a pie. Nobody mentioned either. My father cleared his throat. That sound, I had learned to dread it the way some people dread a phone ringing late at night. He stood, straightened his tie, and lifted his glass. My mother smiled up at him the way she always did when he was about to say something she already knew. "To my son," he said. "To Caleb. The one who carries this family's name the right way." The table erupted. My uncle banged the table with his palm. My aunt leaned over to squeeze Caleb's arm. His wife laughed, pleased and practiced. Caleb ducked his head just enough to look humble, then smiled the smile he'd been smiling since he was 12 years old and figured out exactly what it got him. I sat with my fork beside my plate and looked at my father, waiting for him to finish, waiting for the part where he looked toward me. It did not come. He sat down, and conversation rushed back in around me like water filling a space. My cousin, sitting to my left, bumped my shoulder. "Same as always, huh?" He said it lightly, like it was a joke we both knew. I smiled because it was easier than explaining that it stopped being funny somewhere around my 25th birthday. That night, driving home on the interstate with the city lights building ahead of me, I made myself say out loud the thing I had been half thinking for months. Something is wrong, and it is bigger than a Thanksgiving toast. I need to go back further. I was 9 years old the first time I understood that Caleb and I were not the same kind of child in this family. It was a Sunday in December, and my parents had taken us to a sporting goods store to buy winter gear. I needed new boots. The ones I had were letting in water at the seam. I tried on a pair, brown with a rubber sole. Practical and warm. My mother looked at the price tag and told me to find something less expensive. I did. I found a pair on sale, a size up from what I needed because they were the only ones in my price. Caleb, meanwhile, had found a jacket. It was the kind that older kids wore, the kind that showed up in the catalog photos. He held it up and my father said, without even checking the tag, "Put it in the cart." I wore those boots with the extra sock stuffed in the toe for 2 winters. I told myself I was imagining the difference. Kids do that. They exaggerate the unfairness of things. But it kept happening. When Caleb made varsity baseball, my parents threw a backyard party. When I was named to the honor roll 3 years in a row, my mother said that's nice and asked if I wanted chicken or pasta for dinner. When Caleb got into a state school on a partial scholarship, my father co-signed a private loan without blinking. When I got into my architecture program and needed help with the deposit, my mother said they had already stretched as far as they could. I worked 3 jobs my first year of school. I told myself it was building character. There was one person who never treated me like a footnote. My grandmother on my father's side, a small woman with thick white hair who kept a garden in her backyard even into her late 80s. She came to my graduation when my parents arrived 40 minutes late and left early because Caleb had a work thing. She sat in the second row wearing her good coat. And when I walked across that stage, she stood up. She was the only one standing. Afterward, in the parking lot, she held both my hands and told me, "You have always worked twice as hard for half the credit, and the world is going to find that out." I held on to those words like something physical. The years after school carried their own momentum. I joined an architecture firm in the West Loop, a mid-sized firm called Hargrove Design Group, and threw myself into the work the way I always had. Early mornings, late evenings, weekends reviewing specs when I could have been doing anything else. My specialty was adaptive reuse projects, converting older commercial buildings into residential and mixed-use spaces. I loved it. It felt like the buildings were getting a second chance. By the time I was 28, I had built something real. I had a project portfolio that my director, a steady woman named Ms. Fontaine, had told me was the strongest of anyone at my level. I had a reputation for delivering under difficult clients. I had started to believe the work would speak loud enough that nothing else mattered. Caleb, in the meantime, had drifted through 2 corporate jobs and ended up working in real estate development. He was charming in the way that opened doors for him. Easy laugh, good handshake, the ability to make whoever he was talking to feel like the most important person in the room. He found success the way some people find parking spots, effortlessly and often at someone else's expense. My parents talked about his deals at dinner the way they never talked about my projects. I stopped mentioning my work around them sometime around my 29th birthday. There was no point. Then came the Alderton project. It was a former textile warehouse in Pilsen, a neighborhood on the southwest side of the city, and the developer had brought it to Hargrove as a possible conversion to artist lofts and ground floor commercial space. I spent 4 months on preliminary designs, meeting with the developer, walking the site in every kind of weather, learning the building the way you learn a person. Its stubborn walls, the awkward ceiling heights, the one corner that caught afternoon light in a way that made the whole thing worth saving. I presented the concept to the developer in March. It went well. Better than well. He shook my hand and said he wanted to move to the next phase and that he specifically wanted me on the project. 3 weeks later, I found out through a colleague that Caleb had reached out to the developer independently. He had set up a meeting using a contact I had introduced him to at a firm event 2 years earlier. He had walked into that meeting with a printed presentation, and according to my colleague, who had been in an adjacent conference room for another meeting and recognized the renderings, the presentation included work that looked almost exactly like mine. Not inspired by, not similar to, the same. I drove home that evening and sat in my car in the parking garage for 20 minutes before I could make myself go upstairs. I kept thinking about the site walks, the late nights, the months of work. I kept thinking about the contact I had introduced him to because he had asked nicely at a family dinner. I told myself I was jumping to conclusions. I wasn't. My colleague, whose name I will not share because she asked me not to, managed to get photographs of the presentation materials. The renderings were not identical to my final files. Someone had changed the color palette. The north elevation had been slightly modified, but the spatial logic, the section cuts, the phasing strategy, they were mine. They were things I had developed in my own notes, which I shared with almost no one, which I had once, about a year earlier, shown to Caleb when he had been visiting my apartment and asked what I was working on. I had shown him because he was my brother. I had trusted him because that is what you do. The next few weeks felt like walking on ice you can hear cracking beneath you. I kept going to work. I kept showing up on time, meeting with Ms. Fontaine, advancing the project. But strange things had started happening around me. A potential client who had reached out through my professional profile went cold after one exchange, saying they had heard I was difficult to work with. A peer review panel I had been recommended for quietly dropped my name without explanation. Miss Fontaine mentioned in passing that she had fielded a question from someone about the authorship of a set of early renderings and wanted to make sure everything was properly documented on my end. Someone was seeding doubt about me. Carefully, selectively, in exactly the places that would matter. I started paying attention to timing. Every incident connected back to a period when Caleb had reached out to me, asked a casual question, shown up at a work event I had mentioned. I thought about the contact at the developer's office. I thought about the presentation my colleague had photographed. I thought about all the times over the years I had answered his questions about my projects, not thinking twice because he was family. One evening in October, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off something my mother had left at my apartment the previous weekend. I let myself in with my key. They were in the living room. Caleb was there, on the couch, his back to the hallway. My mother was nodding. I heard my name. I paused in the hallway. "She worries too much," Caleb said. His voice was low, easy. "She always thinks people are taking credit from her. It's a pattern with her." My mother made a sound of agreement. "She has always been a little like that," she said. I stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then I set the bag on the kitchen table and walked back out. In my car, I sat very still. I had heard him before, in smaller moments. The way he would reframe something I had said at a family dinner into a complaint I had supposedly been making for years. The way he could shift the interpretation of anything I did into something that reflected badly on me. But this was different. He was not just managing the story at the dinner table. He was managing it with people who could affect my career. I thought about all of it for a long time. I did not sleep well that week. My college roommate, a structural engineer named Paige Holloway, had been telling me for months that I needed to document everything. She had a methodical mind and the kind of patience for evidence that I admired but did not naturally possess. That November, I called her and said I needed her help. We spent a weekend going through everything I had: emails, file metadata, timestamps on my design documents, the photographs my colleague had taken. Paige is not a lawyer, she is an engineer, but she knows how to build a case from the ground up, and she treated my situation the way she treated load calculations, with the assumption that every number mattered. The metadata on my original Alderton files showed creation and modification dates going back 11 months before Caleb's meeting with the developer. My design notes, saved to cloud storage, had timestamps that told a clear and unambiguous story. The renderings my colleague had photographed showed elements that did not exist in any public version of my work, elements that had only ever been in my private notes. Paige also found something I had not thought to look for. On a professional networking site, there was a profile for a business entity registered under a variation of Caleb's middle name. It had been created 7 months earlier. It listed specialties in adaptive reuse and mixed-use residential conversion. The project descriptions used language that I recognized, not paraphrased, not summarized, but specific phrases I had used in client-facing materials that I had shared with almost no one outside the firm. I pressed my hand flat on Paige's kitchen table and stared at the screen. "He built a professional identity using my work," she said quietly. "That's not a gray area." I knew she was right. I also knew that part of me had been hoping I was wrong. That same week, I got a call from a former professor of mine, Dr. Call Osei, who taught sustainable design at the school where I had done my graduate work. He had referred a potential client to me, a developer interested in a similar warehouse conversion project on the north side. He called to tell me the client had come back to him confused, saying they had been contacted by someone else. Someone who had positioned himself as a collaborator on my Alderton work and had implied he was the primary design lead. The client had asked Dr. Osei if there was a reason I had not disclosed the partnership. There was no partnership. There never had been. I sat with this for 3 days before I told Paige. Then I sat with it for 2 more days after that. The picture it made was not the picture I had wanted to see. Caleb was not just riding on something I had mentioned at a dinner. He was actively building a parallel career using my work. positioning himself as a collaborator I had chosen not to mention, seeding the professional landscape around me with questions about my credibility and my character. He needed me to look unreliable so that when the comparison came, he would come out ahead. I thought about the toast at Thanksgiving, the one who carries this family's name the right way. I thought about how my father had not once, in 32 years, stood up and said my name into a room full of people the way he said my brother's. I thought about my grandmother standing up alone in the parking lot. Then I stopped sitting with it and called a lawyer. Her name is Ximena Oduya, and she was recommended to me by a partner at a firm I had done project work with 2 years earlier. She was direct in the way that good lawyers are. Direct, she did not make the situation feel smaller than it was, and she did not make it feel larger either. She told me that what I had was real, that the documentation was strong, and that there were multiple legal avenues available, including misappropriation of intellectual property and defamation. She also told me something that mattered more than the legal specifics. She said, "Before we file anything, you should know that this will likely become public. Your name and his will be in the same sentence. Are you prepared for that?" I told her I had been invisible for 32 years. I thought I could handle being visible for a while. Thanksgiving came the way it always did, my mother calling the week before to confirm I was coming, reminding me what to bring, not asking how I was. I drove out to Oak Park on a cold Thursday, the streets quiet the way they only are on holidays. I had Paige and my phone on standby. I had already been in contact with Ximena, and certain things were already in motion. I did not tell anyone in my family what was coming. I brought the salad and a pie again. No one mentioned either. The table was full. Aunts, uncles, cousins, my brothers-in-laws. Caleb held court the way he always did, funny and easy, telling a story about a development deal that everyone leaned in to hear. I sat at my end of the table and watched my father watch him with that expression he had. Proud in the comfortable way that does not need to examine itself. My father stood. Glass raised. The room quieted. To Caleb, he said, "Who makes this family proud every single day?" The applause was immediate. My aunt dabbed her eye. My uncle raised his glass high. I put down my fork. I pushed back my chair. The sound of it crossing the hardwood cut through the room like something sharp. Caleb looked at me first. His expression shifted in a way that was fast and small and then gone, replaced by careful blankness. "I want to say something," I said. My voice was steady. I was surprised by that. "Sweetheart," my mother started, "this isn't—" "The man you're toasting built his reputation using my work," I said, not inspired by, not influenced by. My work. My designs, my documentation, my professional language, presented under his name to clients I had built relationships with, while simultaneously telling people in my professional circle that I was difficult, unreliable, and someone they should be cautious about working with. The table had gone very still. "I'm not saying this to ruin dinner," I continued. "I'm saying it because I have documentation that supports every word, because there is currently an intellectual property claim being prepared, and because some of you in this room are people I trust, and you deserve to know who you are actually raising a glass to." The silence stretched out long enough that I could hear the heating vent clicking in the wall. Caleb laughed. It was short and dismissive and did not reach his eyes. "She has always done this," he said. "She can't stand when the attention isn't on her." I looked at him. "I don't need the attention," I said. "I just want my work back." My father had not sat down. He was standing at the head of the table, glass still in his hand, looking between us with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not anger, not dismissal. Something more uncertain than either of those. Something that looked, if I was reading it right, like a man confronting a thing he had preferred not to know. "Caleb," my father said. His voice was quiet. "Is there something to this?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "She's exaggerating. She always exaggerates." "I have timestamps," I said. "File metadata. A professional profile using my project descriptions. Emails to clients positioning you as a collaborator on work you had no part in. Would you like me to get specific?" He said nothing. My uncle, who had been in construction for 40 years, set down his glass slowly and looked at Caleb with an expression that was not warm. My cousin across from me pressed her lips together. Caleb's wife stared at the centerpiece. My father set down his glass. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, quietly enough that it did not carry to the end of the table, "I'm sorry, Rachel. I should have been paying attention. It was not everything. It was not 32 years of dinners and graduation parking lots and overpriced jackets and second-hand silence. But it was the first time he had said my name out loud in a room and meant something real by it." My mother was not there yet. She moved to Caleb's side and began making excuses in a low voice. His wife took the children to the kitchen. The party unwound like something that had been wound too tight. Aunts and uncles found their coats. My cousin squeezed my arm on her way out. I drove back to the city in the dark, with the heat turned up and nothing on the radio. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the way you feel after a fever breaks, wrung out and cleaner at the same time. The months that followed moved quickly in some ways, and slowly in others. The intellectual property claim went forward. Ximena was thorough and patient, and very good at her job. The developer, when presented with the documentation, withdrew from the agreement with Caleb's entity and issued a formal statement. The professional profile was removed. There was a hearing. Caleb did not attend in person. His attorney submitted a statement claiming the similarities were coincidental and that the documentation was circumstantial. The mediator disagreed. He was required to pay damages for the misappropriated work, a sum that was not enormous but that represented something more than money. It was official acknowledgement that the work had been mine. More quietly, the clients and professionals he had been seating with doubt about me began to reassess. Dr. Osei reached out. The developer from the North Side project got back in touch. Miss Fontaine called me into her office and told me that the board had reviewed everything and that she wanted to move forward on a path toward partnership track for me. The professional standing he had spent years undermining steadied and then held. That winter, my grandmother called me. She was 91, still sharp, still tending her garden in the warmer months. She had heard from my father about what had happened. She said very little about Caleb. She said only this: "I always knew they were wrong to overlook you. I'm glad the world finally caught up. I visit her on Sunday afternoons when the weather allows. We sit in her kitchen with tea, and she asks me about my projects, and she listens like the details matter. She is still the only person in my father's family who stands up when I walk into a room. My father calls more often now. It is not a transformed relationship. It is a careful one. Two people learning to navigate a history neither of us entirely understands yet. He has not made another toast at a family dinner since that November. I do not know if he ever will or what he would say if he did. I have stopped waiting for a particular version of acknowledgement from him. What I have instead is a phone call on Tuesday evenings and a man who is, slowly, trying. Caleb and I do not speak. I do not think that will change, and I find that I am at peace with it. You cannot rebuild something on a foundation that was never stable to begin with. What I can do is build something of my own, and I have been doing that for years, whether anyone at the table noticed or not. Paige came to visit last spring, and we sat on my apartment roof on a warm evening with a bottle of wine, and the city spread out in every direction below us. She asked me what the Alderton project had turned into. I told her the warehouse was in construction documents now, that the developer had come back to Hargrove after everything settled and that it would break ground in the fall. She raised her glass. "To the buildings that get a second chance," she said. "I raise mine. That is what I want. If this story has a point, not the legal outcome, not the professional restoration, not even my father's belated and imperfect sorry. What I want is what I have been building toward without always knowing it. A life that does not depend on being seen by the people who chose not to look. A work that speaks for itself regardless of who else claims it. A table where the people sitting around it actually know who I am. I have that now. I built it myself the way I build everything. If you were sitting where I was sitting that November night, evidence on your phone, 32 years in your chest, a room full of people applauding the wrong story. What would you have done? Tell me in the comments. And if this is your story too, in one form or another, stay with us, because you are not the only one who has been made to feel invisible in their own family's house. And the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface eventually, whether anyone is ready for it or not. There is something I have been thinking about since everything settled, something I could not have put into words while it was still happening. It is this: the damage people do in the dark does not stay in the dark forever. Not because the universe is watching, not because of fate or karma in any mystical sense, but because deception is structurally unstable. It requires maintenance. It requires the person being deceived to keep not looking, to keep not asking, to keep choosing the comfortable version of events over the true one. And most people, eventually, get tired of that work. Caleb built what he built by counting on everyone around him to keep not looking. My parents, who found it easier to believe he was exceptional than to examine what that cost me, the clients he courted who had no reason to question his credentials, the professional contacts he quietly poisoned against me, who took his word because he offered it so smoothly. He was very good at making the comfortable version feel like the obvious one. What he did not count on was documentation. Timestamps do not have feelings. File metadata does not protect anyone's ego. The work I had done at 2 a.m, alone at my drafting table, with no one watching and nothing to prove, that work left a record, and that record did not care how charming he was. I think about that sometimes when I am on a job site, walking a space that is becoming something new. The bones of a building do not lie. You can cover things with drywall and fresh paint, but the underlying structure either holds or it does not. What Caleb built could not hold because it was not built on anything real. What I built? The late nights, the client relationships, the careful documentation, the years of showing up and doing the work, even when no one at my family's table asked about it. That held. That is still holding. The harder thing to sit with is my father. I have thought about what it costs a person to look at their child and see what they want to see instead of what is there. I do not think my father is a cruel man. I think he was a man who made a story about his family and then protected that story instead of paying attention. The toast at Thanksgiving, the way he said Caleb's name into a room full of people, that was not malice. It was the result of 32 years of choosing not to look. His apology that night was small and imperfect, and the first honest thing he had said to me in a very long time. I am holding it carefully, the way you hold something that is fragile and not yet what you need it to be, but might become something real with time. What I know now, on the other side of all of it, is that the person who does the work quietly, without applause, without the toast at the end of the table, that person is not losing. She is building. Every year I sat at that table and drove home without being seen. I was still adding to something. The work existed whether my father acknowledged it or not. The designs were mine whether Caleb claimed them or not. The foundation was there before anyone thought to look for it. Paige raised her glass to the buildings that get a second chance, and I have not stopped thinking about that. I was a building that got a second chance too. Not because someone saved me, because the structure was sound enough to be worth saving. That is what I want to leave you with, not the legal outcome, not the moment at the table when his deal collapsed. Just this: do your work like the record matters, even when no one is looking, because someday someone is going to look, and when they do, you want what they find to be the truth.